Good evening. Thank you for being here. I'm Lynn Pollard. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the facilitator for the Cropland Advisory Policy Group. These are the group members. That we also have staff from Boulder County here. The purpose of this evening is we've got 3 experts that'll be talking with us. And the purpose is that they will, is for us to all learn something. The intent is to offer some information. And we ask people to please be respectful and open to all information, whether it agrees with what you believe or not, but to really hear it. The committee will be asking them some questions and engage in discussion with them. Boulder County staff will also be available to answer questions that the committee raises. And just so everyone knows who staff is, could I have the staff just stand up and introduce themselves? Tina, do we have any other staff in the room? Jesse.
Rob Alexander and Megan Huffman.
Okay, so you'll hear other voices besides the committee and besides the experts and my voice. That's who will be speaking. The way that the evening is going to go is we do have some housekeeping we need to complete, which is our standard way of completing the notes and the minutes from the last meeting. So I want to review those, guys. So if you would take them out, we'll do those. Then we'll have Ron Stewart will talk briefly about the process as a whole. So where this committee stands in the broader process for the county. David will introduce our speakers, then they'll be speaking, and then we'll do our questions and answers, which will be handled as the group knows in a round robin, so that we all get an opportunity to ask the questions that are important to us. There are a couple of ground rules for this evening. We understand that people have lots of different opinions. We also wish that to be respectful to all the different opinions, and particularly the different opinions that are in this group as they're talking. So it is really important that there be no applauding, no booing, no cheering, no clap, I mean, none of those things. Really just be respectful. These are volunteers who have put their time in. You may not agree with their opinion, and there will be lots of ways as a public process you can communicate that. This is not the forum for that. We really want to have an important conversation today where we get lots of information and lots of opportunity for this committee to get the questions answered that it wants answered. So our request is that we behave respectfully to the people that are here. That also means simply no side talking, please, because that is also disruptive to the people that are here. They've worked really hard. And so to help them do their job best, it's best if we can be respectful and listen to what they're talking about, whether we agree with it or not, and honor the fact that they have opinions that may or may not be ours. Okay, so I appreciate that, and I will take responsibility to help us keep that in order, but that's what I expect to happen this evening. Okay. Let's start with the minutes. Can you guys look at them and see if there's any corrections? Richard? Yes. Brian, you have to turn those things on for them for this part, please. Thank you.
It's primarily a comment. I would like to see all of our minutes. In fact, the real substance of these minutes is when we are talking the policy matrices.
Yeah.
And a good way to record those as the minutes is what we actually agreed to in the form of a republished matrix. In other words,
yes.
Put the language in it, not little cryptic notes like
Yes.
are in here, which don't necessarily convey what may ultimately be written down on that matrix.
Yeah, absolutely.
And therefore we don't, because of the way it's done now, we really don't have a record of what is agreed to or not.
In a standard meeting, that matrix is immediately fed back, if you'll recall. We're not doing it this time. I appreciate it, but I'll make sure that does happen so that you all get to see that, yes, that's what you agreed to or didn't agree to. Thank you. Anything else on the minutes?
Yeah, on the front page,
Yep.
it says KB issues to think about soil structure. That should be soil structure.
Soil structure. Got it. Thank you.
Just a harvesting.
Couldn't imagine what soil stretcher was, but okay. By the way, for those of you that don't know, we videotaped this meeting. We also were audio taping it. Both of those will be available on the Boulder County website. Okay, anything else on the minutes? Can we approve them as stands with the corrections that were just made?
Approved.
Approved?
Yes.
Okay, great. Ron, can you come up and review for us the process that we're going through?
Thank you. Hi, and welcome. I'm Ron Stewart. I'm the Director of Parks and Open Space in Boulder County, and just want to go over a little bit of what we're involved in here and kind of what we've done so far and what we will be doing in the months ahead. We're in the process of working on a Cropland Policy Advisory or Cropland Policy that will give the Department of Parks and Open Space its direction in terms of managing the cropland acreage that Boulder County owns as open space. Currently, we own about 16,000 acres of land that is cropland in Boulder County. Most of that is irrigated cropland. A little of it is dryland cropland. But the goal is to have a policy that will govern really the management of those lands over time in Boulder County. And so what we've done, and we have this little slide, and I think that it's available as a handout as well, that talks about some of the things that we've done and that we will be doing. Last year, we started the process in April of 2010 with an open house. We have done farm tours, 4 of them last year, 2 of them this year. As a matter of fact, we were out last night in 4 buses with about 200 total people on the buses out visiting different kinds of agricultural operations in Boulder County. We did, in October of last year, a Sustainable Agriculture Forum that brought in various experts to talk about sustainability. We did a farm and ranch panel in February of this year where we had local farmers and ranchers talking about the sorts of issues that they deal with. We're now in the part of the process that is this Cropland Policy Advisory Committee, which is meeting tonight. And we anticipate that this process will continue through October, that their work will be done by October, after which then we'll go into a more public input, public decision-making sort of period of this entire process. One of the things that's going to happen fairly soon is that the advisory committees that will hear this draft cropland policy, those being the Farm and Agriculture Policy, Food and Agriculture Policy Council and the Parks and Open Space Advisory Committee, are going to hear a report on sustainable agriculture that we had developed as part of this process and that we have been using and looking at sustainability issues. And throughout the CPAG process, we have taken written comments from members of the public who are present. And if any of you tonight have written comments, there are sheets, papers out there that you can submit your thoughts on. So once that Cropland Policy Advisory Committee process is finished, and we'll be into the public input part of this. Actually, one part of the public input will start before the Cropland Policy Advisory Committee recommendations are made. We're doing a public input session on September 1st. We're going to begin that session at 5 o'clock, and we'll stay as long as it takes for members of the public to make whatever comments they would like to make about what they would like to see in the management of cropland in Boulder County. And that meeting is going to be held at the Parks and Open Space Office, which is at 5201 St. Vrain Road here in Longmont. We'll also be doing, after the cropland policy draft has been prepared by this committee, we'll be doing an open house. That's going to be on October 19th. Information about the location for that will be on the website closer to the time of the meeting. Recommendations, these recommendations then, draft recommendations, will go as I indicated to the Parks and Open Space, our Parks and Open Space Advisory Committee, and the Food and Agricultural Policy Council. They will have a public hearing on consideration of that, and any members of the public who wish to speak will certainly be encouraged to do that at that meeting. The exact date of those meetings will also be decided later and on our website. We think, however, that those deliberations will occur in December. Then, after that, the Board of County Commissioners will hear the recommendation of the two advisory committees, as well as this Cropland Policy Advisory Group, and will make a decision on the cropland policy. And that hearing will be, the date of that hearing and the location of that hearing will be determined later and will be on our website. So that's basically what we're about. We're involved in a fairly lengthy process here in terms of looking at what should guide the management of agricultural land that is owned by all of us as residents here of Boulder County. What should those policies be? And we've been engaged in a number of activities, as you can see, and we're about halfway through. So, thanks.
Thanks, Ron. Okay, David, would you come up and introduce our speakers? Thank you.
Hello, my name is David Bell. I'm the Agricultural Resource Manager for Boulder County Parks and Open Space. And I was coming here to introduce our panel, but in reality, we're going to give them some time this afternoon to introduce themselves. That's what they'll be talking about, is their background, their history, and why they're here to talk to the panel. So the real quick piece of this for me is the fact that we have Dr. Michael McNeill from Ag Advisory. He comes in from Iowa for us. We have Kent Davis. Well, I guess we'll go in order here. Then we have Dr. Phil Westra, Professor of Weed Sciences at Colorado State University, and Kent Davis with CropQuest. And I just want to add, since they're going to be talking about themselves, I've had the chance the last couple of days to go out in the field with Dr. McNeill and Kent Davis, and it was just an amazing opportunity to spend the day out there with two professionals in this field that have a lot of very great information to share. And then this afternoon, spent some time with Dr. McNeill and Phil Westra, and again, it was just an amazing opportunity. So I hope this panel gets a chance to really take advantage of the expertise that's sitting here this afternoon from these individuals. So that'll be my piece, and we'll turn it over to them then to talk about a little bit about their background and why they're here tonight. Sorry? They don't.
Okay. So, gentlemen, you get to decide who's going first. Okay, we'll take about 5 minutes each, and then the committee will have some questions. So. And
All right.
reintroduce yourself, please.
All right.
Thank
I'm
you.
Michael McNeill. I'm from Algona, Iowa. I was born and raised on a grain and livestock farm near Algona many years ago, as you can tell by looking at the color of my hair. My formal training was at Iowa State University. I have a BS degree in agronomy, where I specialized in soils. I have a master's degree in plant physiology, and I have a PhD in quantitative genetics with a minor in plant pathology. After leaving Iowa State University, I worked with the USDA Epiphytology Research Lab, which is located in Frederick, Maryland, at Fort Detrick. For those of you who probably more likely recognize that as the Biological Warfare Center for the U.S. Army. I spent several years there working as a plant pathologist. I then managed a plant breeding research station for about 12 years for Funk Seeds, located there in Iowa. Then in 1983, I started an agricultural consulting firm, Ag Advisory Limited, which I still am the owner and operator of today. I work with about 165,000 acres of land. About 6,000 of that is organic farming. The rest is what I call more conventional farming. Work with about 125 growers in various ways. My company also does contract research with the federal government, with universities, and also with private industry. Most of our work is concentrated around plant nutrition, soil nutrition, I've spent a great deal of time in the past few years trying to get my arms around some of the nutritional problems that we're seeing in the crops in the Middle West, particularly in corn and soybeans, but also some other crops such as oranges down in Florida and some wheat up in Canada. We're seeing some issues with application of certain herbicides causing quite a bit of problem with nutrition and disease resistance within plants. So that's a pretty quick wrap-up of who I am and what I do.
Okay, thank you, Dr. McNeill. That was Dr. McNeill. Dr. Westra.
Well, I'm going to defer until my slides are up because a bit about me is included in my slides, so you'll get that in a minute.
So, Jesse, you got them? There they are. And you're welcome to stand up if you want and use this.
Well, I'll twist around here.
Okay.
Briefly, I was born on the dairy farm in Wisconsin in 1946. Joined the Peace Corps at age 19, went over to French West Africa and Niger, learned French in Zerma, worked with very, very poor farmers in one of the poorest countries in the world. Got my PhD at the University of Minnesota. I also have an undergraduate degree with a major in French, philosophy, math, and science from the University of Wisconsin and Calvin College, which is a private school in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And then I went to Ecuador for 5 years and worked with Quichua Indians. My house was at an elevation of 11,000 feet. Worked with very, very poor farmers in Ecuador. I've been at Colorado State University for 25 years as a professor of weed science. I'm 50% research, 50% extension. I've trained 35 graduate students in my career, most of them at the PhD level. And my most recent graduate student, we got his paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. And it's entitled, Gene Amplification Accounts for Glyphosate Resistance in Palmer Amaranth out of the southern United States. So I have a very active and aggressive research program with some outstanding students just up the road at CSU.
These two guys have been around. I stayed home. I'm a fifth-generation Coloradoan in agricultural base. My great-great-grandparents homesteaded in about 1870, about 3 miles north of Boulder County. My granddad farmed in Boulder County, and I farmed in Boulder County. Back in the 90s or late 80s when my granddad had retired as kind of a side to what I was already doing as a crop consultant. I graduated from Colorado State University in agronomy in 1979 and started a consulting career in Great Bend, Kansas 10 days later. And pretty well that's what I've been doing ever since. I moved to Yuma, Colorado 2 years later and became division manager for another company. Grew that business out, and in 1985 I got an opportunity to move back to the Front Range to bring the knowledge and thoughts and experiences that I'd gained in these other areas back to an area that I love, an area that I have great passion for. And that's this local area. And I get to work with some really great farmers here and have since 1985. And in some cases, one of the oldest farmers is 81 now, and I've worked with him continuously since 1985. I personally have about 25,000 acres that I look at every week. The schedule is to be back at the same farm the same time each week. We look for pest problems, water management, plan fertility programs, plan crop rotations, plan what kind of varieties, hybrids we're going to plant based on the issues that are there. In addition to that, I'm also the division manager for CropQuest, my company in Colorado. I have 4 other employees at this time, and most of them are based pretty well along the South Platte, although one of them is in the Ogallala Aquifer in Yuma. trained many people over the years, some of which work for the Extension Office, some of them which have worked for CSU or various entities thereof, other fertilizer companies. I am a member of the NAICC, which is the National Organization of Crop Consultants, have presented there. I am a CCA, which is a Certified Crop Advisor, and have been on and off since 1993 when it was incepted. Mostly, I guess what I'd say is I'm a child of the 70s. And just like a lot of you, you look at what's going on in the world and say, you know, I kind of want this to be protected for my kids. Or I want there to be soil left and food left and farm ground left so that my kids and my grandkids can live healthfully too. That's about conservation. It isn't necessarily about whether we use pesticides or don't. I am a child of the 70s, and I intend to preserve our natural resources to the best of my ability.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. As you know, the conversation this evening is specifically around GMOs, but also the committee is working on issues of sustainability, economic sustainability, soil health. There's a whole lot of things we've already been talking about. But as we came up to the conversation around GMOs, it became clear that it would be important to have some experts in their opinions, and you guys may not agree with each other, and that's also fine. So, but that we hear different options, and we hear what people are thinking about. Okay. So the way this is set up is the committee will do a round robin, and I'll simply ask. I'll start over there with Dia and ask her to ask a question, and we'll keep going. They may ask you directly, or they may ask you as a group, and you can choose. All three of you can choose to answer, or maybe only two of you have an answer for that question. It's really up to you guys. Does that work? Yes.
Could I just interject? I have about 5 or 6 slides that I had hoped to present. I don't know how you want to
You are welcome. Absolutely.
Let's let him do it.
Yeah. Please.
Go for it. Go for it.
I didn't realize there were more slides you had. Absolutely. Jesse, you've got them? Go ahead.
Let's go to the next slide. I want to start at sort of a high level on this whole genetically engineered crop issue. And depending on which track you want to take for the world population, whether it's high birth, medium birth, or low birth, you can see that in the next 20, 30, 40 years, the world's population is going to escalate far beyond anything we can comprehend today. We think that Somalia and Kenya and East Africa has drought problems and famine. We've seen nothing in terms of what may be coming down the road. The next slide, please. If you look at Iowa, it's very interesting compared to the U.S. in terms of soybean adoption for genetically engineered traits. These are all traits. This would be herbicide resistance, insecticide resistance, all traits. You can see that Iowa is almost 100%. This is data from 2011. You can see the U.S. is just slightly lower as a total national average. And the second set of bars is for corn, which is a bit behind. Similar data exists for cotton, sugar beets, alfalfa. Needless to say, genetically engineered crops have really swept the United States in very, very rapid fashion and have made a huge impact on our national food and fiber production. Next slide. I've actually done quite a bit of research myself, looking at the impact of genetically engineered Roundup Ready crops on weed shifts or weed population dynamics. I have a study that I've conducted at Colorado State University for 13 years. We go in every year, we count all the weeds, we collect the yield data, and we have 4 strategies. Number 1 is the farmer that cuts the rate and only puts on a half a rate of glyphosate. Back when we started, it was a pretty expensive herbicide. Now it's cheap. The second strategy is a full rate of glyphosate, which is 1 quart per acre. The third strategy was rotate. Every other year you use glyphosate and you rotate with conventional chemistry. And the fourth strategy is those plots never saw glyphosate, strictly conventional herbicides. And those treatments were fixed in space so that that piece of ground only got that treatment for 13 consecutive years. You can see here's a year where we had corn and soybeans. We also had sugar beets as part of the rotation long term. We actually had Roundup Ready spring wheat as part of the rotation. And so we were looking at crop rotation and herbicide effects That study is about 8 acres. It's a huge study. Next slide. We collected data over the years that was geo-referenced. And if you look at these images, each of these is a single plot. And where you see what appears to be a mountain peak, a high peak, that's a lot of weeds. Where you see something that looks blue like the ocean or kind of flat, it's very few weeds. And so we're able to geo-reference all of the weed population and look at the dynamics of the system over time based on the crop rotation and based on the herbicide strategy which we were looking at. Next slide. The bottom line was, if you use sort of a mixed herbicide approach with some pre-emerge herbicide followed by glyphosate, so this is glyphosate high plus a pre-emerge herbicide like Lumax or Bicep or something like that, our yield advantage was 19 bushels to the acre. Now you pencil that out at $5 or $6 a bushel, you're looking at $50 or $60 additional income. And we see a bigger impact if you go to the low glyphosate, the farmer that was trying to shave the rate, which we know is bad for resistance problems, but he also had less weed control. We had almost 24 bushel advantage. So these are the kinds of findings that we're coming up with in our Roundup Ready crop research that we can share with our farmers, whether it's alfalfa or corn or soybeans or sugar beets. Next slide. We've also looked at the influence of timely weed competition. No competition here. You put down Lumax pre-emerge. Here you wait until the corn has got 5 leaves and you spray it with Roundup, and so the weeds compete early. And if you look closely over here, this is about the 10-leaf stage of corn where the weeds have competed that long. Next slide. And you see a direct impact not only on the size of the ears, but also a direct impact not only on your corn yield, but the number of kernels. We counted all the kernels on every ear for 720 ears of corn for 2 years to look at the impact of weed competition on kernel production, and that's where your yield loss comes from. Next slide. So I want to close with 2 slides, and it's just my opinion. It is my opinion after 15 plus years of genetically engineered crop research with sugar beets, corn, soybeans, alfalfa, canola. Commercial genetically engineered traits are safe per federal guidelines and being deregulated and tested. I personally have seen no adverse genetic engineered crop effects in all of my years of research with those crops, disease or otherwise, or yellow flashes. Genetic engineered crop technology, including drought tolerance, cold tolerance, nitrogen use efficiency, salt tolerance, etc., will be required, in my opinion, to feed the world and provide crop products with improved human health in the future. And biofuel genetically engineered crop production will be important in the future as we look to reduce our dependence on imported oil. Next slide, final slide. It is my opinion that farmers who use genetically engineered crop technology are great stewards of the land that they farm. They are not here to destroy the natural resource, but to conserve it, as Kent said, and to save it for next generations and to take care of it. After 25 years of working with farmers, that is my firm conviction. Farmers in Boulder County, in my opinion, should be free to use organic, conventional, or genetic engineered crops in their cropping systems, and reasonable guidelines on rotating herbicide mode of action or on the frequency of glyphosate use could help address concerns of herbicide-resistant weeds. I know some people are very concerned about that. I'm working on 5 glyphosate-resistant weeds in my research program with graduate students at CSU as we speak. And I believe that in the long run, genetic engineering crop technology will help deliver global, what I'm going to call green crop production, something that's more efficient, less reliant on pesticides, and less reliant on imported oil, and green crop production.
Thank you, Dr. Westra. I appreciate that. Dr. McNeill, did you want to make some comments about how you see things? And I don't know if you have slides or not, but would you like to make some comments? And then we'll ask Ken.
Well, I guess I have seen things perhaps a little differently than what you have seen here. In Iowa, we've been seeing some crop damage occur. I saw it start in about 2005. I noticed that the top leaves of our corn plant were turning yellow, almost like they've been frosted, the first week in September. 2006, it was about 7 to 10 days earlier. Saw the same thing. By 2007, I was seeing it in the middle of August. So the crop is dying earlier each season. And I asked a lot of questions, what's going on? I started examining some areas. We're finding quite an increase in fusarium in the soils, and we're seeing a lot of stock rot causing this problem. As I looked at the crop this year, I was seeing some of this yellowing as early as the 28th of July. So the problem is progressing and progressing fairly rapidly. In reviewing some of the research that's been done by several different universities, I've discovered quite an increase in fusarium, maybe as much as 15-fold on those fields that received glyphosate applications. So I thought, well, okay, that must be what's going on. We started splitting stalks, looking at the stalks in these diseased plants. And I noticed that as early as V3, that's a young plant, it's probably only 3-4 leaves, V3, V4 area, I was starting to see crown rot move into that plant. So by the time it reached tasseling time, it had plugged enough phloem and xylem tissues that it was cannibalizing itself to reproduce. Other issues that I've seen, an increase in Goss's wilt. The last 2 years has been very severe, a disease we've never seen before in Iowa. Just swept across the state, moved as far east as Pennsylvania and as far north as up into Canada. We've also seen a dramatic increase in sudden death syndrome in soybeans. I'm seeing, I told you I worked a lot with nutrient management. I'm seeing a lot of micronutrient deficiencies in the crops, more than I've ever seen before. This year it was very, very evident in nearly all of the fields that the second application of Roundup caused yellow flashing. The crop turns yellow where the sprayer starts out or places where it overlaps. And this generally goes away in a few days. It is now, it's stayed for a couple of weeks. So the severity of this damage from glyphosate seems to be increasing. We're also seeing quite an increase in mycotoxins in the feed grains. This is causing quite a bit of problem in our livestock production. It's to the point of being serious in some herds. We're seeing reduced breedback. We're seeing reduced fertility in the livestock, reduced production in both hogs and cattle. We're seeing some issues with death in the poultry from the mycotoxins. I'm seeing even in the stock residues that are used for bedding for the livestock, creating some issues from these mycotoxins as the animals tend to eat some of that bedding. And so quite a different picture. We've used glyphosate probably more intensely than you use it in this area. We've had a lot of problems with resistant weeds because the product is relatively cheap and easy to use. We've increased our rates, tried to control the weeds, and that has probably added to this issue, but we certainly are seeing some problems with it.
Okay, thank you very much. Kent Davis, do you have some comments you want to make?
Well, I might as well show them a couple slides too, what the heck.
Okay, that'd be great.
One of these days we'll get to the questions.
Within the next 5 minutes.
Okay. We had a chance to spend a little time together yesterday with Dr. McNeill, and so I had a chance to hear some of his thoughts. So I put there was a couple things that stood out. He spent some time discussing how adoption of that farmers in Iowa are tending to go away from GE crops. I think Dr. Westra has already shown that that really doesn't seem to be the case. I called a couple of my colleagues up there to say, you know, are you guys seeing these same kinds of problems? And it seems to be far less widespread thought-wise in the area, with all due respect to Dr. McNeill. And within the literature search, there's some discussions along this line. In fact, Purdue talked about the fact that there's not necessarily something that might be happening there, but it seems to be a fairly small situation. I thought it might be interesting to see where we're at with yields, because the idea that yields are dropping within the situation, that it really doesn't seem to be the case. So we got 97 through 2001. I couldn't get all the data on one slide, both for Iowa and Colorado. And I think 97 would have been one of the additional initial years for Roundup Ready use in the United States. And you can see in Iowa's case and Colorado's case that pretty even yields during those years. Next slide. But as we continue into 2010, we're seeing increased yields, particularly in Iowa. And nationwide, next slide, the trend is very definitely towards higher yields nationwide. Nationwide, we've adopted a lot more GE technology, not just Roundup Ready, but many things that are helping control some of the other pest problems that we have in corn. And I think the trend line is good along that line. It doesn't show any drop. My next slide really comes down to something that I picked up in Germany when I was touring a facility there. They have a clock that shows the population on top clicking along, getting ever bigger. By 2050, we're supposed to be up to 9 billion people, and that we're supposed to have to figure out a way to double our food supply in the course of the next 40 years. Something that would have taken us the last 100 years to do. We have to double our food supply to feed the world. And we need some help all along the way. Along the way, the bottom line is arable land, and that clock's ticking the other way. We're losing arable land. We're losing it to urbanization, and thank God that Boulder County managed to save this land for agriculture. But we need to feed the world with it. That's my last slide.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to go round with questions. Your question can be asked directly of someone, or it can be asked to the panel as a whole. They can choose how they want to respond. Let's just pay attention to being concise in our communication so that we get to ask as many questions as possible. That's both to the panel and to the group. Okay, Dia, you want to start for us?
Yeah, Dr. McNeill just mentioned some of the problems he's seeing in Iowa, and I wonder if the three of you could have a brief discussion comparing and contrasting some of the, sorry.
Brian, can you turn that mic up slightly?
Do you want me to start over? Yes. Okay. Dr. McNeill just mentioned some of the problems he's seen in Iowa with the cropping systems, and I wonder if the three of you could compare and contrast the similarities between the crops and the glyphosate usage and maybe some of the other factors that would come into play between Iowa and Colorado, because I understand that Iowa is glyphosate year after year after year, and corn, soybean, corn, soybean, corn, soybean, and I don't know that that's happening anywhere in Colorado, so can you talk about that a little bit and bring out the differences, please?
Well, I probably know less about Iowa too, but particularly in our local area, we have a very diverse agriculture. And in fact, in Colorado, it's very diverse. It's one of the reasons why it's very hard for the university system to focus as hard on something like corn or soybeans, because we have such a diverse cropping system. In the local area, you know, our cropping system is really based on sugar beets, because of the history of the area. And all the other crops in this area were basically rotational crops for sugar beets for the most part, over the course of the last 50 years anyway. So in order to produce sugar beets well in our area, we couldn't really grow them year after year after year. We had to have rotational crops, partly for weed control, partly to get rid of the diseases. We have a specific problem with cyst nematodes in sugar beets and rhizoctonia in sugar beets that have been here forever, long before we ever had Roundup Ready crops. So in order to keep those problems to a minimum, we have 4 or 5 crops that are usually in rotation. As Roundup readiness have come into the area, obviously with corn to begin with, there's a wide adoption. In fact, in Colorado, one of the local seed guys told me that other than maybe 2 or 3% of the corn that his company sells are all GE traits. So 2 or 3% is conventional within the state. And those 2 or 3% are primarily going to organic growers. Because of the problems that we encountered with other herbicides in the past, atrazine for one, and weed resistance that we saw develop with atrazine in the 80s, and of course I was there for that, and ALS herbicides came along, and they're very safe and specific enzyme safe, specific enzyme site of action, of mode of action, but easily defeated. So again, we saw resistance develop. So when Roundup Ready came along, I was very insistent, and still to this day, that we practice 2 or 3 modes of action with corn to preserve that. And at least to my knowledge, we have no resistant weeds in Boulder County, other than the natural resistance that would be there all along. So am I getting off track or taking you everywhere you wanted to be?
Well, I think part of Dia's question was about the difference between Iowa and here, in part.
So
maybe
from
Dr.
a Roundup Ready standpoint, yes, we probably have people that are growing corn on corn year after year. That doesn't happen very often on the Front Range.
Dr. McNeill, did you want to add anything?
I see quite a difference in the way crops are grown here versus in Iowa. We have a lot more intense usage. However, I see the soils here are perhaps a little more fragile than those in Iowa. We have 4.5% organic matter. Your soils do not appear to be anywhere near that in organic matter. So I think we have a little more resilience in our soil to herbicides, particularly to glyphosate, but we are certainly seeing some of these issues arise. On the yields that you were showing, I think that that's true for statewide. Glyphosate has made poor farmers good, and on some of the poor land, glyphosate has raised the yields. What I'm seeing on our highest productive land is a decrease in yields. And so where I'm looking at 200 bushel plus yields, I'm seeing those go down. On poorer land, I'm seeing it steadier up. So our overall state yields has probably been up, but on some of our better land, some of these problems are starting to cut into top yields. Okay. So there is a difference. We are using a lot more glyphosate. We have a lot more weed resistance problems, so we use higher rates.
2005 was the first year you saw problems. How long had you been using, or had farmers been using glyphosate continuously by that point?
We started probably 1996, 97, using it fairly heavily.
Okay, thank you. Dan, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I didn't get to meet with you yesterday, but one of the producers had said that you said that your organic yields were equal to your conventional yields, and actually you said that some of them were slightly higher than some of your conventional yields, and I was actually wondering that if you, and then he explained to me that your organic yields had a very different rotational system for their cropping versus the conventional. And I was curious that if the conventional people would have the similar rotation, if you think you would see those differences in the yields.
That's a fair question. Typically, our corn yields in organic grown corn follow alfalfa, and that tends to give us a nice boost in yields. And so those averages tend to run a little bit higher. Our more conventional types are corn, soybean, and those yields are not quite as high. I did not see a direct comparison, so I cannot answer that, but I could theorize that it would be less of a difference.
Okay. And then my other question, trying to compare it to Boulder County, is in Iowa, is that more of a factory organic system where they're growing primarily organic corn and soybeans for animal production, or do you see it, in our area, we see the organic as more of a, I call it a garden variety. We're growing vegetables for farmers markets and stuff like that.
The organic grain that's produced goes into organic dairies and organic hog feeding setups and egg laying setups. So it's more of a factory farm usage of the organic grains.
Great. Thank you. Richard?
Hello? Okay. I would like to ask any of the panelists to talk a little more about some of the soil health aspects of the GMO crops and their associated herbicides or insecticides, as the case may be. In particular, there is research that's appearing now showing that with some of these GMO crops where glyphosate is used, that there are changes in the soil microorganism colonies by species classes, as well as, and in particular, the fungi. I would like to see some answers regarding your understandings of, one, what's causing that, and two, what are the effects on the crops themselves and the downstream uses of those crops in feedstuff and food. In particular, let me ask specifically about the beneficial versus the harmful fungi, and the effects on some of the diseases that are associated with those.
Go ahead. Take it. Go ahead. I may need more than 5 minutes for that one. I'll try and some of the studies that I have followed, we're seeing changes in the soil microbiology as a result of glyphosate applications. The greatest changes occur when you apply glyphosate to growing plants, and the glyphosate is translocated or moved down through the plant into the roots and out into the rhizosphere and then into the soil. As this occurs, we see quite a change. For example, in a gram of soil that has never had glyphosate applied, you would see around 7,250 reducing organism colonies and probably 750 oxidizing. The study showed that when glyphosate was applied, we ended up with about 740 reducing, 13,500 oxidizing. And the importance of that is that for plants to take up minerals like iron, nickel, manganese, zinc, they need to be in a reduced form. So you need a lot of reducing organisms to make the nutrients available to the plant. So you could soil test your soil and it'll show that it has a high level of nutrients. So you should be in good shape. But if the reducing organisms are not there to make it available to the plant will be malnourished. We also are seeing quite a dramatic increase in certain pathogenic organisms in the soil, such as the fusariums. Some studies are showing as much as a 15-fold increase in fusariums. The nitrogen-fixing bacteria, the rhizobiums, are been shown to decrease. Some of this work comes out of Dr. Kremer in University of Missouri, a USDA scientist. So there's a lot of changes going on beneath the surface of the soil when glyphosate is applied to growing plants on that soil. Not so much when it's applied directly to the surface. I hope that
Anyone
covers
else
part of
on the
that.
panel have a comment? Yeah, Dr.
Well,
Westra.
I'd like to just say, I think in fairness, you could probably make many of those same statements for any herbicide or any pesticide applied to the soil. I don't think that changes to the flora of the soil are unique to glyphosate. You might argue that they're worse or better, but I don't think that process of changing the population dynamics of the soil, it perhaps happens with atrazine, it probably does, other herbicides. I would like to state for the record that when you apply glyphosate to a glyphosate-resistant plant, soybeans, corn, alfalfa, sugar beets, the amount that is exuded from the roots into the soil is exactly 0. There is no glyphosate exuded from the roots of glyphosate-resistant plants. Now, if you kill weeds and they die and they start to degrade and break down, obviously you can get some glyphosate into the soil. And if you're spraying your weeds and some of it gets on the soil, clearly some can get into the soil. But I think to create the perception that when you spray millions of acres of corn or soybeans that all of this glyphosate is being sucked down into the soil just flat out is not true. And I think science would show that to be the fact. So I would just say that as I look at what's happened in Colorado agriculture over the last 20 plus years, being in a semi-arid environment, in particular for the winter wheat producers, glyphosate is the single most impactful tool that our farmers have had access to improve, reduce tillage, minimum tillage, get away from soil erosion, wind erosion, control the weeds with glyphosate, conserve moisture, and basically revolutionize crop production in the state of Colorado because you're protecting the soil, you aren't plowing it all up, you don't have the wind and the water taking your soil down the river. And I think we have to acknowledge the fact that glyphosate has been a highly beneficial tool for growers in a semi-arid state like we have in Colorado, as opposed to Iowa where they get probably 30, 40, or whatever inches of rainfall a year.
Okay.
Could I ask
Thank you.
one follow-up question to your comment? And that is, you said that the glyphosate will not move from the plant tissue to the soil. Is that what I heard?
I said it is not exuded from the plant into the soil in glyphosate-resistant crops.
So what's different between what I said and what you said? Would you explain? You said
Well,
will
I guess I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think you could come away from this meeting with the implication that virtually all glyphosate gets into the soil and causes massive disruptions to the ecosystem of the soil. And I'm trying to make the point that any glyphosate that gets on a glyphosate-resistant crop stays in that crop.
Okay.
What about the metabolic breakdown products of glyphosate? You may say glyphosate does not move, but what about the metabolic products that are breaking down? And what about the adjuvants that are applied along with the glyphosate?
Well, we know that in general, with the exception of legume crops, glyphosate is very little metabolized in plants. It is an herbicide that basically circulates around in the plant. It is relatively stable in the plant. And you get very, very slow breakdown of glyphosate in a plant. And this is why it's effective on so many plants. It keeps going back to the meristem and to the growing point. So I stand by my contention that the glyphosate applied to a glyphosate-resistant plant stays in that plant and does not start leaking out into the soil and causing damage to the soil.
Okay, thank you. Jeanette? And need to pull that close, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dia and Richard already asked my questions, as did Dan. But I would like Dr. McNeill to, could you please explain the last statement you made before Dr. Westra spoke on the soil, on the compositions of the soil, and what you saw as a residual of either using glyphosate or not using glyphosate. And all I could think of was whatever your last statement was before, you went on. And if not, otherwise.
I'm not exactly sure or remember what it was I
Yes.
said. I was talking about the glyphosate exuding from the roots into the soil.
Right.
And I was talking about those plants, the weeds, that are susceptible to the glyphosate application.
Right. Okay.
And so those are the ones that will bleed that off into the soil.
Okay. One of the things that I'm hearing from all of you is that it appears that the application amounts used obviously are going to be more of a driver on some potential issues, whether in in using glyphosate, or also our crop rotation. Like here in Colorado, because of our semi-arid conditions, we're not using it as predominantly as you might in Iowa. That maybe it's also a water-driven. Is that potentially possible? That it could be more a water-driven issue because you get a lot of water in Iowa that we don't get here. Could that be a trigger for other things going wrong in the development in the plants?
No, I don't believe so. Glyphosate is a strong chelating agent, and it's looking for metal ions to grab onto. The word
Okay.
chelation comes from the word claw, and so if it finds a calcium, an iron, or a zinc, it's ready to grab onto it really tight. And so it does not stay in a free state too long. It likes to hook up with a metal ion. And it'll do so in the plant, making that ion then unavailable for use by the plant. Manganese, for example, is easily tied up. And that destroys the plant's shikimic pathway,
Right.
and which is its disease-resistant pathway. And it does the same thing in the soil. If you apply glyphosate directly to the soil, it's going to grab onto the calcium, magnesium, iron, other minerals in the soil very quickly and stay hooked or attached to them until something comes along that will cause it to change. And there's been some research done that shows that glyphosate breaks down relatively slowly. The first metabolic breakdown of that forms AMPA. It's amino methylphosphonic acid. And that's also a very poisonous substance. But when phosphorus fertilizers are applied to the soil, either in the form of manure or commercial fertilizers, it converts back to glyphosate again. And so you get that cycle going back and forth so that it ends up having a relatively long lifespan in the soil. I've seen research say that it'll last 3 years to 4 years in the soil. I've seen other research show that it will last up to 22 years for a half-life in the soil. So 22 years from now, half of it's still there. I have not done any of that research, nor do I have an opinion on which one's right, but it does have strong residual capabilities in the soil.
Okay. Anyone else on the panel? Any other comments? Yeah, Kent.
Well, I'm not sure I can really focus on, all the science that's based on that, because I haven't done any research in that line. But I have used glyphosate since the 70s. And,
Since the 70s?
back in the 70s, yes. When I was 16 years old, we were using glyphosate to spray bindweed and thistles in Weld County. And actually, the weed districts were helping out after a while because it was one of the few things that we could put on for bindweed and thistle control and still grow a crop in that. Prior to that, we were applying picloram, Tordon, which probably has a lot longer half-life, I think, than glyphosate does. It was pretty effective, but you couldn't grow anything else on that ground. We'd have heavy rates of dicamba for the same purpose. It was routine to have spots out in every field wherever you had perennial weeds. Well, perennial weeds are a big part of this county. And so to be able to have something to work on the perennial weeds and still be able to grow a crop in that area is kind of important. I haven't really seen evidence in the county before Roundup Ready crops or after Roundup Ready crops of the problems that Dr. McNeill talks about. Our Roundup Ready yields seem to be higher than our conventional yields. 2 years ago in the county, there was one farmer who had half of his field planted to conventional beets and the other half planted to Roundup Ready beets. The Roundup Ready beets ended up yielding 30.4 tons with the 15.6 sugar for a total income of $1,642. The conventional beets made 23.8 tons with the 15 sugar for $1,214 an acre. So the Roundup Ready beets gained him $400 an acre. The next year, because of the weed problems in the conventional beets, we had to spend additional money on that part of the farm to clean up the weeds that we didn't get killed the year before. But the idea that we're going to have a problem with Roundup buildup, maybe there's some places that it's happening, but it's a herbicide that's been used for 40 years.
Okay, thank you. Jules?
Thank you. I'd kind of like to address this to Dr. McNeill. First of all, I certainly enjoyed our visit and your time out on my farm yesterday, and it was very helpful to me as well. But I wanted to touch on the fusarium issue that you say you're seeing in Iowa and maybe possibly caused by glyphosate. And my question is, you know, the big push by our government and NRCS the last 10 years has been leaving high residue, and we're going to no-till, strip-till, minimum till. Can you attribute, is there a possibility that you can contribute the fusarium to the high residue content that's left on top of the soil? Or I know when I grew dry beans several years ago, you know, whenever I had a fusarium problem, a lot of times it was caused by soil compaction as well, that decreased plant health or root health. So I was wondering if you could follow up on that a little bit.
Okay, well, drawing on just my practical experience, we are seeing a lot more residue on the surface. Glyphosate has allowed us to do more no-till or strip tillage, which is putting more residue on the surface, making more fungi available for contaminate or infecting our new crop. The research that I was quoting was looking at these organisms that was in the soil. In other words, it had been turned into the soil. So I think I kind of agree with you. We're seeing that increase because of change in cultural practices. But the research project showed that it was also building on its own. And they theorized that that was because there was a reduction in the pseudomonads in the soil, which is more the, I guess I could call them the policemen of the soil, that kind of keeps these fusarium blooms from happening so quickly.
Does anybody else want to follow up on that question?
Fusarium is a group of fungi. It's a very wide group. And so the fusarium issues that we deal with, it's certainly one of those groups that it takes advantage of the situation. I think maybe that's what you're saying. You know, if you have, in 2006, we had a terrible problem with curly top virus that entered our beet fields, and we had problems in the tomatoes. and peppers down in New Mexico. And the curly top caused a fusarium infection to occur. That was just a double whammy for our beet crop that year. A few situations where we had counter, for example, on our beet fields, a few people that were applying insecticides at that point in time didn't end up with curly top and therefore didn't have fusarium either. So it's a good example that a stressful situation can set you up for a problem. And I think there's a possibility that it might come down to Roundup, but there are so many stressful situations that allow for fusarium to occur. We have an issue this year in the barley where there is some mycotoxin showing up in the barley, and some fields were rejected. Well, that's barley that isn't Roundup ready, no GMO events on that, no Roundup on it at all. It just happened to be a stressful situation at flowering that caused a fusarium head mold at that point in time. A few, down in New Mexico, the Napi Indians deal with mycotoxin issues in their corn all the time. Part of their issue really comes down to earworm feeding on their corn late season, and then that earworm allows the fusarium to start, another stress. Well, one of the potential solutions for that problem might be a GMO that would control the earworms before they get started on the ear. And we have those. And so that looks inviting. All the other things that the Navajos have tried haven't worked out well for them. But the new Super Stack thing or the Smart Stack program that has a BT earworm gene in it looks pretty promising for that.
Okay, thank you. Emily?
I don't know, am I allowed just one?
Yeah, go ahead if you got one more to say.
After Dr. McNeill, after coming out to the farm yesterday and you see, I'm sure you just seen a small taste of what maybe goes on in this county, but with the crop rotation that most farmers use in this area with probably corn and sugar beets and small grains, can you see Roundup then as more of a valuable tool and with the crop rotation as a better balance?
Well, I think, I talked about that a little bit, and I've thought about it a lot more since we met. I think it has a good value for you in your sugar beet production. I mean, it's just no question. Your sugar beets were outstanding. It appears to me that the use of glyphosate has some negative issues, and I've talked about it at length. And yet it's a very good product for handling a problem that sugar beets poses for us. Is just tremendous, is controlling weeds in the sugar beets. And so perhaps utilizing that on an every, 3 or 4 year basis when you grow the sugar beet, saving that for that use and not using it on other crops would be a judicious use of that product and work very well for you. It give you the weed control you'd like, it give you the profitability that you'd like to see, and probably minimize as much as possible the negative things that I've been discussing, because they are very real when you use it too much.
Okay, thank you. Emily?
Okay, so I have 2 questions as well, and they're not directly related. The first question is, it was mentioned earlier that atrazine was used and it's no longer not being used as much. So what happened to the soil? Why don't we use it as much? What happened to the plants? What was the decision-making process on that, please?
Well, atrazine is still a very, very widely used herbicide, but number one, because of water, groundwater concerns, the use rate has been reduced dramatically across much of the United States. Probably cut in half or more. You may be able to address Iowa's use of herbicide, an herbicide like atrazine, and in some parts of the country it's just not allowed anymore because of threats to groundwater. But my colleague Dale Shaner has done an extensive amount of research on what we call the accelerated biodegradation of atrazine. And it's well documented that there are microbes in the soil that very rapidly adapt to using atrazine as a food source. And he has soils collected from all over the United States, from Hawaii, from Australia. He has soils where atrazine is gone in 1 or 2 days. You put a pound of atrazine on, 2, 3 days later, it's gone. And you say, well, where did it go? You know, this is laboratory research. You do it out in the field. It didn't leach down into the groundwater. It didn't adsorb to the soil. The microbes have degraded the atrazine and eaten it up. And years ago, we saw this with eradicane and sutan and a lot of the thiocarbamate herbicides, a similar phenomenon. The other issue that has really affected atrazine is widespread triazine resistance in a wide range of weeds where atrazine no longer controls those weeds. We've come out with some newer herbicides that are more effective at lower use rates. But I would still guess that atrazine ranks in the five or six most widely used herbicides in the world.
What does it do to the groundwater specifically?
Well, it is not something that you want to get into the groundwater if you can avoid it. I think there certainly are tolerance levels for the amount that can be in groundwater. But I know that its use near streams and around sinkholes or tile drainage systems in the Midwest was really strictly regulated to prevent it from getting into the groundwater. It's not viewed as something you want at very high levels, if at any level. And I think as a nation, we've done a good job of managing that product. You'll occasionally see a spike in the spring after a very wet spring, but by and large, the levels have come way, way down, and I'm sure you can address that a lot more from the Midwest.
Yes, we've reduced it probably even further than you're thinking. It's used at a very low rate, and it's been proven very effective. Once it gets in the groundwater, though, we've seen some carcinogenic problems with it, and we really don't want it in the water. So Iowa has pretty strictly regulated how close to any source of entry into the groundwater that you're applying it. And farmers have done a very good job of avoiding that because they drink the water also.
Does glyphosate have any effects on the water as well?
Glyphosate is not easily moved into the water. It is a strong chelator, and it grabs quickly onto a metal ion and generally stays attached to the soil.
Okay. Okay, so my second question is general for all of you guys.
We have one guy wants to.
Oh, sorry.
Ken wants to.
Sorry.
It comes down to we're on a big continuum here. And maybe it started with Rachel Carson or the 70s, or maybe it started with Dick Nixon deciding that we were going to have an EPA and all that. But over the time, the companies that make pesticides and the companies that make GMO events have been listening to the public. And that is, hey, we don't want stuff that has high leachability. We don't want stuff that has a long residual, a long half-life. We don't want stuff that's going to go contaminate our water or contaminate our air. We want fairly short residuals, low water solubility, low toxicity. And all those people have been listening. It's gone from a situation where they could discover a new herbicide under the old rules or a new pesticide, maybe 1 in 1,000 chemicals that they tested that showed some promise, to now it's 1 in 1,000,000. It went from a process of maybe costing $6 or $7 million to take a pesticide from discovery to commercialization to costing nearly $300 million in 12 years of research and testing, both within the companies and for the federal agencies within the country and in other countries. So when we've looked at atrazine, it used to be our base level thing. We're going to go out there and run 2 pounds of atrazine, and that's our herbicide program. Today it might be, we're going to go put on a half a pound of atrazine with some Callisto and some Dual and have a pretty good base program, and then maybe come back and pick up whatever other weeds we have with a Roundup trip. So that's kind of as time has gone on over the last 30 or 40 years, our plans keep changing. sometimes the weeds change or the insects change, so we have to change for those too. But we also have great respect for how the rules change. And the government's done a good job in saying, hey, this one's maybe not quite as safe as we'd like, and come up with something new. And it costs more, it takes more time, but those things are happening, and they will continue to happen.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so my other question is, putting Roundup Ready crops aside, can you guys just give me some examples of other GE crops that are out there, what they're for, what they're doing, other than just put the Roundup Ready away?
I'll give you 2 or 3 examples in the herbicide area. You have what we call Liberty Link crops. These are crops that are genetically engineered to be resistant to glufosinate, which is a different herbicide. You have Liberty Link corn, you have Liberty Link soybeans, you have Liberty Link cotton, you have Liberty Link canola, I believe. So Liberty Link or glufosinate resistant crops would certainly fall into the category of what you're asking for. Dow AgroScience has developed 2,4-D resistant soybeans and corn through genetic engineering. They are in advanced stages of testing as we speak, and I predict within 2 to 3 years they will be on the market and just as available as Roundup Ready corn or soybeans are. In fact, what you're likely to see happen is people will start stacking multiple herbicide-resistant traits, so now you could spray glyphosate and 2,4-D right over top of your soybeans, which normally would just nuke your soybeans with the 2,4-D. There is another company developing dicamba-resistant genetically engineered crop technology, both in corn and soybeans, and it will likely come into other crops in the future. So this issue of genetic engineering for herbicide resistance is not unique to glyphosate. It's probably the one that's certainly the widest in distribution and use, but there will be others that come down the road.
I think other GMO crops would be the BT conversions that give us resistance to corn borer and to rootworm. And there's several BT events that do that. I'm seeing now some separation. They're stacking these genes so you can get Roundup Ready, corn borer BT, rootworm BT, and several events of each. And I'm also seeing them start to separate it out so that you can just get corn borer BT or corn borer rootworm BT. So there's several ways that you can genetically produce these and group them. So I think we're going to see maybe more choices available to us in the very near future.
Okay, thank you. Ken, did you want to add something?
There's a ton of them.
I just want to give one very interesting example of genetic engineering that's been used to eliminate a virus problem in papaya for people that live in the warmer parts of the world. And it's extremely successful, very effective, but politically a real hot potato in terms of its acceptance on some of the islands where papaya is grown for local consumption and also for export. And if you ever want to see a real success story of genetic engineering, that would be one to look up on the web, papaya.
Okay, thank you.
You can, you think to yourself that the average chemical company is looking at why are they just looking at herbicides or insecticides? But those are the very things that, you know, when you talk to farmers and say, what are your biggest problems? It's going to be grass control in corn, or it's going to be broadleaf control in soybeans, velvet leaf, for example. Corn borers are a 60 bushel an acre hit if you got a bad corn borer problem. If you have a bad rootworm problem, it's a 60 bushel an acre hit. So those things were things when those people were looking at stuff and said, yeah, this would be nice to do. The fact that we could use, we can't use this in Boulder County open space right now, but we use triple stack corn on a lot of corn on corn acres. That eliminates our need to go out there and run counter insecticide or Aztec insecticide that are old organophosphate insecticides. Pretty low LD50s. Not fun stuff, and most farmers would just as soon not have to run counter insecticide. They much prefer using something like a smart stack or a triple stack corn to deal with that. But one really example that I really want to bring up is about sweet corn. And sweet corn, one of the biggest problems in sweet corn is earworms. Okay, you go into the grocery store, it just drives me up a wall to see the ladies out there opening up the sweet corn, and anything that doesn't look good, they're throwing it in the bin, and that goes out the trash. It absolutely drives me up a wall. But earworms are unacceptable. And the one sweet corn grower I was working with a few years ago had a semi-load go to Houston, Texas. They found one earworm in the bottom of the semi and condemned the whole load, sent it back to Colorado. One earworm. Well, in order to keep sweet corn earworm free, earworms lay their eggs right on the silks of the corn as the corn grows and the silks progress. In some cases, in Florida a few years ago, they were getting 700 or 800 moths a night. So they were spraying sweet corn every 12 hours with insecticide to keep out the earworms. We have an attribute sweet corn now from another company, from one of the GMO companies, that pretty well takes out the earworms. There's going to be a new introduction of sweet corn from a competing company to do the same thing. Rice in the world, what is it? Half the world's people are fed on rice? And they're going to introduce a new golden rice in the next 4 or 5 years that's vitamin A enhanced to be able to feed people that can't get that kind of thing, that can't eat meat to get that kind of vitamin that they need. They eat rice only. So there's lots of stuff on their list that says we can make food safer and have to be able to put less pesticide on. It's a big list.
Thank you. Keith, you have a new direction you want us to go?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of head in a new direction. On private land today, we're coexisting with using GE crops and conventional farming right next to organic producers. And with a set of protocols in to protect both sides, do you guys have any reasons why this can't continue in the future on both private and public land?
I'm sorry, I couldn't really hear the question very well.
Do you want to try it again, Keith?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Today, we are coexisting on private land with organic producers, and we will in the future. Do you see any reasons with protocols in place to protect both types of producers that there's any reason why we can't do this on public land in the future?
So the question is there any reason coexistence between organic farming and conventional farming or traditional farming can't happen from your points of view?
I see no reason why it shouldn't happen and can't happen. It happens in plenty of other places. I have farmers that have been organic and decided not to be anymore. I've had farmers that were partly organic and weren't anymore. I have farmers that work with other farmers that are organic and they're not. You know, they all work together pretty well. I think coexistence is a very important part. I mean, it's what makes a farming community a farming community. Whether or not you're a hog raiser and your neighbor happens to be a chicken raiser, or you're a bean producer or a corn producer. Whether they're organic and you're conventional, whether you're growing GMOs and they're not. I think coexistence is absolutely positively the key to working together and making it work.
So I suspect the committee would like to hear from the other two gentlemen as well.
Well, I'll just say at CSU, I do a lot of research at the horticultural farm, which is just north of Fort Collins, where you get off on Mountain Vista Drive. And they have a very large and successful certified organic vegetable and production system there. And I'm right next door to them. But I must tell you, I have a lot of respect for what they're doing in the organic project. I see them, I talk to them, they look across the road at me with my tractor and my sprayer. But at any rate, I'm very cognizant of not trespassing on their land. If the wind is blowing, I will not spray anything. We have a 50-foot buffer that's required by law between us. And so I think for myself, I've had the pleasurable experience of learning to be a good neighbor with someone who does vegetable and crop production much, much differently than I do. Now, having said that, if I were a private crop producer, I can tell you which of the two systems I would use, and I'm not laughing because it's funny, but I'm telling you, the number of people that they have to have out there hand weeding and hoeing and taking care of the weed problems is it's mind-boggling. And so, you know, again, I must tell you folks, you're maybe going to find this hard to believe. I shop at Whole Foods. I like to go there for the salmon and for the lamb and certain things at Whole Foods. I patronize Whole Foods for certain things that I want in my pantry and in my life. But I also go to King Soopers and Safeway. I don't discriminate and I don't pick against one or the other. But I think it's just to be objective. You have to acknowledge, at least from my perspective, and it's just my perspective, a true total organic production system is much more manage intensive and labor intensive. You talk to Andy Grant and try to figure out how many people he could get to go work in his fields and pull weeds this year. He couldn't get them. They weren't out there. And he's had to let acres go to weeds like you just can't believe because he can't get the people to come out and do the work. So you just have to acknowledge that there are strengths and weaknesses to each of the systems, at least from my perspective.
Okay, Dr. McNeill, your thoughts about coexistence?
I think that they can work together. On my own farm, I have part of my farm is organic and part of it is not. And I haven't gotten in too many fights with myself. Occasionally I get upset.
You talk to yourself?
But I do have some concerns. I have concern with pollen drift. I have concern with GMO alfalfa because that's pollinated by bees or other insects. And I have some concerns there. So distance is important. And I think tolerance and appreciation for what the other person is doing is very important. And I watch out on my own farm which way the wind's blowing when I'm spraying, and I get along fine. I've avoided crops that are pollinated by insects, and I get along fine. I think that distance is going to be crucial, though, and being a good neighbor is most important.
Okay, thank you. I know that only 7 members of the committee have had a chance to ask questions, and I just checked with the other 2. Because this is a longer meeting than usual, we're going to just take a 10-minute break. We'll come back, and Jeanette and you will ask their questions, and we'll continue to give you guys a break as well. So 10 minutes exactly, please. Thank you. All right, well, we're going to get started, and I'm going to bounce back to Jane and go to you, Yul, okay? I'm going to you, and then Jane will go next, because she's not in right this moment. So can you see the panel from where you're sitting?
Yes, if you'll move a little more. Well, I just want to make a couple of comments that we have 2 experts that are presenting one side of the issue and 1 expert that's presenting the other. So if each expert answers 5 minutes apiece, then we're all going to get twice as much information on one side of the issue. So I would propose that Dr. McNeill gets to speak for 10 minutes. I'd like to...
Yeah, you may recall I asked you to keep your applause to yourselves, please.
I'm not really being tongue-in-cheek either.
I know you're not, but would you please ask your question, Yul?
Okay, secondly,
Thanks.
I'd like to say that I know Dr. McNeill has lots of great photos of these problems he's seeing that clearly demonstrate the problems he's seeing in Iowa. I know that he was told that he would not be able to give a presentation visual, that he could just talk about himself, that it would all be oral. So I noticed that the other 2 presenters were able to present their...
Do you have a question?
You know, their points. And I'm disappointed that I'm not able to see these pictures. Thirdly, and this is just like yes or no answer, no explanation from each consultant.
Okay.
Do you receive either direct funding for projects, or do you earn income from the sales of from genetically engineered crops or Roundup?
No.
No.
Because I thought I saw Monsanto, Dr. Westra, on the one slide that you showed at the bottom.
That is funding that goes to the university, not to me directly.
Okay. Thank you.
So, did you have another question?
Okay, so Dr. Westra, you were speaking about the glyphosate and how it doesn't get exuded out the roots, how it travels around inside the plant. And that's good for the soil because it doesn't end up in the soil directly exudated through the roots. But what happens to either those of us that eat food that has glyphosate contained within that plant, or an animal that might eat alfalfa that's had glyphosate sprayed over it year after year after year? And what might we expect from this animal, and what might we expect from ourselves having consumed glyphosate over the years? And I'd like that, and Dr. McNeill too, please.
Well, it's the same thing with any pesticide. You have tolerances that are established for the use of that product and the amount that's allowed either in the harvested grain or the forage. This is all based on the relative toxicity or the safety of the product, and I believe glyphosate has been shown to be one of the safest herbicides ever discovered or developed. And so it's clearly almost any of the pesticides that are used on our fruits and vegetables and our row crops, there are small amounts that are found in the food that we consume. That's been deemed to be safe. Whether it is or not, you can debate, you can agree or disagree. But that's the way our system and our society works, and we have probably the safest or one of the safest food supplies in the world and one of the best nourished populations in the world. I've lived in Africa, I've lived in Ecuador, I've lived in countries where people don't have access to the quality of food and the safety of food that we have. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't be extremely vigilant about these issues, but as long as glyphosate's been around and used, I'm not aware of any documented evidence of significant, widespread adverse human or animal health problems that have arisen.
Well, I guess I'd have to disagree on some of that. I have seen issues with livestock. I have seen issues with humans with micronutrient deficiencies that appear to be the result of glyphosate chelation of those minerals. I have been testing animal manures, for example. We use a lot of animal manures in Iowa for fertilizer, and I am finding anywhere from 0.2 to 1.3 parts per million of glyphosate in these animal manures. So it is being consumed by the animals eating the grain and is passing through into the manure. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and Dr. Westra, one thing I hear a lot, and I think that people that aren't very familiar with agriculture can sometimes get misled, is a lot of times people will compare a GMO corn crop and they'll say, look at all the labor that it would go into it if it wasn't GMO, if it was organic, for instance, and then they'll refer back to a mixed vegetable field, which isn't fair, because even in a conventional vegetable field, you still got a lot of guys out there working, so I just need to point that out. But secondly, I think it's great that you spent a lot of time in Africa and South America and working with those subsistence farmers. I too have done that. And I'm always a little perplexed when I hear about how GMOs are going to feed the world, because I just can't imagine these subsistence farms going out there with GMO crops and spraying glyphosate and back and forth in these little patches of fields where these guys are. And so could you paint me a picture about how specifically the farmers you worked with in Ecuador and Africa, tell me how they're going to benefit if you go and give them GMO corn and soybeans tomorrow?
Well, I would argue that the papaya case is an excellent one. It's raised mostly by smaller farmers on these islands, and you've developed a genetically engineered solution to a virus problem in their crop that gives them a product that they can market and get a fair price for. And I would say that that kind of genetic engineering in a crop is scale insensitive. You could be a small farmer with half a hectare, or you could have 200 hectares, and the benefit would be similar. Now, you could argue that some of these traits are more scale sensitive in terms of large farmers with 5,000 or 10,000 acres. I would argue, based on what I've seen in my lifetime, and I think if you really follow the global demographics, whether it's China or India or Pakistan, it makes no difference. The mass exodus of people leaving the countryside, trying to go to cities to make a better living, make more money, have access to smartphones and TV and all that sort of stuff, it's going to continue. And I think the day may come when you're going to have to take all these quarter hectare, half hectare, 1 acre, 3 acre, 4 acre pieces of land, and you're going to have to convert them into large scale pieces of land for food production just to feed people. Now, you can argue that's not fair, but in Ecuador, when I was there 25 years ago, it was already a serious issue. Every time a family had 5 kids, they'd split that land 5 times. And then each of them had 5 kids, and they'd split it another 5 times. And next thing you know, a guy's down to a quarter of an acre to feed a family of 6 or 7 or 8, and it's just, that's all he did, is just stayed on that land and raised crops and pulled weeds and hope for the best. So I would argue, just from my perspective, that things are going to look very, very different globally 50 years from now. I may be wrong, but that's my personal opinion.
Okay, thank you.
And just one more thing. Dr. McNeill, you consult on 160,000 acres or so, and I know that the people here view you as being someone who is, you know, seeing problems with GMOs. Would you please tell us about whether you have farmers that are growing the GMO crops, and why in the world they would choose to continue to use a guy like you that is seemingly opposed to the widespread use of GMOs and glyphosate? After all, there's probably lots of crop consultants in Iowa, I'm sure, that they could use instead of a guy that's sitting here representing the opposite camp.
Well, I specialize in soil and plant nutrition, and my growers understand that, and they have told me that, okay, I want to use GMO crops on this land. Okay, I've told them of the hazards of doing that. I've told them of the hazards of using glyphosate. They say, I realize I have a nutritionally deficient crop. What can you do to help me fix that? And so I do a lot of work, foliar feeding, getting the minerals back into the plant. I do starter fertilizers, in-furrow treatment. I do a lot of work to beef up what glyphosate has removed. And that is working for them. They're willing to pay the extra price for the convenience of using glyphosate. And I'm getting good yields, and that's probably why they use me, because I've been able to help them build a better nutritional value in their crop, build the soil back, some of the losses that they've had, and we're trying to maintain a good profitability. I do, however, see a lot of them starting to say, you know, really this just isn't working. And they're planting non-GMO corn particularly, and having really good success with it. So I've seen a lot of success. I'm seeing transition fairly rapidly. It's voluntary. They're just because they make more money doing that.
Dr. McNeill, I have a question. I know that you all had mentioned that you may have been directed not to bring slides, and I don't know if, and I know Dr. Westra did and Kent Davis did. Did you have any slides you wanted to share with us?
I have a slideshow that I have put together that is a pretty descriptive of some of the literature that's out there, but it takes quite a long time and probably not appropriate for
Okay.
this meeting tonight.
Okay, I just wanted to check on that for you. Jane, you haven't had a chance to ask any questions, and I know a lot's been asked, maybe some you were already thinking about. Do you want to add some?
Yes, I'd like to ask all three of you how you're assessing and looking at those various studies out there that are claiming a linear correlation between an increase in glyphosate and some health issues, particularly things like spontaneous abortion in livestock. What you think about the validity of those studies? Is this really a growing problem? Just give us a sense of that. And then the other part of that question is, what's your assessment on how, on top of that situation, the three federal agencies, USDA, EPA, and FDA, are in recognizing that and dealing with any allegedly potential hazards of glyphosate to other, not to the soil, but I'm talking about to livestock or even people?
I'll let you guys go first.
Who wants to start for us?
It's an issue that has come up. We've been looking at that. We being a group of scientists that have discovered some problems along this line. We have looked at and found what we believe to be a new organism that is currently under study. Right now we're doing the PCR work so that we can classify it as to what it is. It is appearing quite commonly in, well, we've found it in 6 states. We've found it in lots of materials, different plants, corn, soybeans, oak trees, in livestock, found it in eggs, milk, meat. We found it in semen. We found it in placental tissue, fetal tissues from miscarried animals. There's a lot to be learned about it. It appears to be associated particularly with sudden death, disease in soybeans, Gossa's wilt in corn, oak scorch in oak trees. It's a very, very small organism. It takes an electron microscope to see it. We're not sure if it has a symbiotic relationship with other bacteria or with fungus. So there's an awful lot of questions to be learned yet and answered. I did go to talk with people at the USDA in Washington, met with them and talked about the potential problems and the need for research monies to study that. It sounds like we're probably going to be able to obtain some funds. It's created quite a stir with many people. But I think it's important that we study it and try and find out, is it a serious problem, minor problem, or no problem at all? That's sort of where we are with it right now.
Can I ask a clarifying question? You're talking about this new organism. Are you saying that there is some linear correlation or causation with glyphosate? That was my question.
It appears to perhaps have some relationship in that when crops are treated with glyphosate, they have more of a chance to come down with these diseases. I've tried applying better nutrition, foliar feeding soybeans, for example, the right minerals, seems to pretty much eliminate the sudden death. If I spray spray them with glyphosate and do not come back and correct the mineral deficiencies, see a lot of sudden death move into the soybeans. It seems to be the same case with Goss's wilt. There's been some research that says it's maybe not the glyphosate, it's one of the adjuvants that's with it. But whenever we spray it, we seem to have an increased problem. So there's an indirect relationship, yes.
Okay, you wanted to hear from the other two as well?
I do. And also, again, the extent to which you believe the three federal regulatory agencies are aware of, looking into, and responding to this if it is a problem.
Please ask that again.
And whether you believe, to what extent, the three oversight agencies at the federal level, USDA, EPA, and FDA, are cognizant of this, are looking into this, and are appropriately responding.
They are aware of it, and they are starting to respond.
Okay. Dr. Westra?
I really don't work in this area, so I'm going to defer to other people. To me, it's clear that the BT trait has improved the quality of grain that is fed to animals and probably overall improved or diminished the chance of animals getting sick from aflatoxins and that type of thing, and I think that's been well documented. But as to the issue of glyphosate's direct implication in birth biology problems, I'm not an expert in that area, and I think if it was a massive issue, you'd have a major research initiative on that at this point in time. I'm not aware of such an initiative, so I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I'm suspicious that it's not a massive issue.
Okay. Kent?
Well, and I'm not an expert on this either, but I've done a relatively thorough data search. Well, I shouldn't say it's thorough. I spent a little time looking at the contrary side of it. And one point became clear that regulatory agencies around the world have concluded that it's not a reproductive toxin or a teratogenic causing birth defects. And that's one piece of data I found. That Purdue, Dr. Huber is one of the people that supports this theory, and he's a retired plant pathologist, I believe, from Purdue. And Purdue and them themselves, and I did a data search on that and talked about the glyphosate implications, basically state that despite the, one statement is, despite the potential for herbicides to increase disease levels in certain plants, plant pathologists have not observed a widespread increase in susceptibility to plant diseases. Although some research indicates there's an increase in disease severity on plants in the presence of glyphosate, it doesn't necessarily mean there's an impact on yield. Many factors influence the level and type of disease given in a year. Got another article that came from my Ag Professional magazine just a couple of months ago that discusses this Goss's wilt issue. Other people within the state of Iowa seem to agree that there's an increase in Goss's wilt, but they see no direct correlation with glyphosate relationship or a nutrient deficiency. Rather, they saw increased Goss's wilt and a direct correlation between susceptible versus tolerant hybrids. Goss's wilt is one of the issues that I had to deal with in Yuma, Colorado back in the 80s. It was very prevalent out in that area. One of the corn companies did an excellent job to come up with Goss's wilt tolerance, and the other corn company really didn't do a very good job with it. Consequently, guess who gets to plant what kind of corn? And I did talk to that corn company today about this Goss's wilt thing in Iowa with a couple of questions that Dr. McNeill had brought forth. His thought is that the increased residue programs that they're practicing across Nebraska, Iowa, and the rest of the corn belt are increasing the potential for Goss's wilt, but that I think that that's one of those things that we've had to address in terms of varietal resistance. So at least as far as I can see, most of the scientific community doesn't seem to be in agreement with Dr. McNeill or Dr. Huber in these issues.
Okay, and a clarifying question for the two of you, not Dr. McNeill, because I think you answered that about what you other two think about how much confidence level do you have in those three regulatory agencies to observe, study, and respond to that if it becomes a problem. And I did want your opinion on that, all three of you.
Okay, just a couple things. One, a quick reply to other people studying this. We did receive information and pictures from Chinese researchers. They had even better pictures than we've had of it. And they said that they are finding it in soybeans that we had shipped to them, and that it was causing infertility problems for them. So that's very latest information. It would not be published anyplace. To answer your question, my confidence in those agencies' ability to research this, they certainly have the capabilities to do that. I think they're looking for reasons to do it. They are not convinced, as of yet, that it's worth looking into.
Okay. Dr. Westra and Kent.
Well, just briefly, I'd say they're probably underfunded and understaffed and may not have the expertise to really deal with this. Oftentimes they have to farm it out to some outside expert. And I've never worked with those agencies, so I'm just generally a bit suspicious of the federal government. That's just my personal position in life. And so I'll just say that with a grain of sand.
Okay.
Grain of salt, I guess.
Sand and salt. Well, I'm not a big government guy either, but the thing that I think that, you know, I probably tried to demonstrate a passion tonight for what I do, because I believe that what I'm doing is right. And I have good ethics, I try to practice good ethics, and I expect everybody else to. I expect that from my federal government, and I expect that of the EPA, and the FDA, and the USDA. And I really believe that in the end, yes, they're going to study everything that needs to be studied. Now, whether or not they happen to deem that this is an important project today to go take up, I'm not going to answer that. But I think they have a pretty dang good track record over the course of the last 50 years in identifying problems. I think there's probably things that they've banned over the course of time that probably shouldn't have been banned. But they did it out of the goodness and safety of what they're trying to do for the public. So I think, yeah, I think they are trying to do their job correctly.
Thank you. We've heard, all of the committee has asked a question, and many of them have additional questions, which I'm going to give them time to ask, but I want to make a statement first to the committee, and also to the panelists. The committee's tasked with drafting policy, and the area that they're struggling with right now is genetically engineered. Is it okay to have genetically engineered crops in Boulder County open space? That's basically the real conversation that's underneath all of this, whether it's glyphosate or whatever else we want to talk about. They're dealing with that. They're dealing with the issue of can we have coexistence in this county? What would that look like? So I want to know what else you as a committee need to know from the panelists that can help you dive into that conversation, which is where ultimately we're going to have to dive. We may not get there tonight. In fact, I'm not sure we're going to get close to policy tonight. But what else do you need to know from this group? How else what information can they help you with? Yes, Jeanette, sorry. I keep doing that.
Thank you. Do you have studies that show the difference nutritionally between GMO versus a traditional crop? I mean, we're talking about soil health. That's been one of it, but a lot of the concern is that with the increased number of GMO crops, that they may not be healthy for you. And I wanted to know if and I know there's studies on both sides. That's part of the conflict. And what studies are you using? What have you found that I might be able to grapple with better?
I have research data with me that shows the difference between regular alfalfa and GMO alfalfa, regular corn silage or non-GMO corn silage and GMO corn silage, and corn grain. It would take me a few minutes to dig that out, but I do have it available and can make it available to you.
Can you speak to it at all without digging it out? Just what's some of the basic distinctions?
The minerals in general, thinking one in the alfalfa, for example, we're seeing reduced amounts of manganese, zinc, iron, and magnesium. They were all lowered. Copper was lower, iron and nickel. Very similar in the corn silage. Not as much difference in the corn grain. It's the whole plant that I see the most change in.
Okay. Anyone else?
I have a 3-year study I did comparing conventional alfalfa to Roundup Ready alfalfa, and the benefit of the Roundup Ready system was that you are more consistently able to produce forage quality or dairy quality alfalfa, much higher quality product with less weed and less other types of plant material in there. And overall, the milk production and the milk yield was higher for the Roundup Ready alfalfa. And I think, again, it's largely due to your ability to produce a much higher quality crop with minimal effort.
Okay. No? Okay, other questions that are sitting out here? Yes, Dia?
I'm sorry. I'm going to follow up on some of Jane's questions and what Dr.
Sure.
McNeill said. Involving this organism, this new organism, and I don't remember what you called it.
I didn't.
No, sorry.
It's a new organism.
Okay. So has that been, and I've got actually a series of questions about those. You said that is infecting both plants and animals, and I'm curious how many pathogens out there infect both plants and animals. I thought pathogens were generally host-specific and didn't go across species. I'm also curious if any tests...
We'll do one question at a time, so let's
Okay.
just take the first one.
Okay, your question is, does it grow?
Well,
in general, pathogens that are plant pathogens are not animal pathogens or human pathogens. That's correct. This is the first one, to my knowledge, that does do that. So it's significant from that
It's
point of view.
significant, and has that been confirmed, or has there been any
Yes.
outside tests to
They've
confirm
used
that
Koch's
beyond?
postulates to test that.
Okay, that there is a lot of disagreement among the science community, as far as I understand about that. That people are claiming that that hasn't been confirmed.
No, it has been
that,
confirmed.
it hasn't been independently confirmed or peer reviewed.
It has not yet been peer reviewed. We're waiting on the PCR work to be completed before that peer review takes place.
How often are studies confirmed or not confirmed during the peer review process? I'm just curious. Actually, I have no idea. I'm thinking
have
of
no
like the
idea.
monarch butterfly study that was not confirmed.
Right.
Well, I'm an associate editor for a journal, and if something doesn't pass muster with your peers, which are fellow scientists, who normally are chosen anonymously, you don't know who they are, and if they reject your manuscript and the science, and it doesn't see the light of day, and it happens, I wouldn't say a lot, but probably on the order of 10 to 15, maybe 20% of the science that's submitted for publication never passes peer review, and then it's just somebody's opinion. So the rigor in that process varies from journal to journal, clearly. The further you go up the elite ladder, the more rigorous it becomes. But I've seen a lot of stuff that's had to be retracted, that was accepted, printed in very reputable journals, was then proven to be fraudulent science, and people have to retract their publications. That's not a pretty sight, and the federal government does not like to see that sort of use of their dollars.
Okay.
I think one of those was a bacteria that was thought to cause heart problems. Turned out to be a prion rather than a bacteria. They have put this organism through the synchrotron and tested it, and it is a living organism. It is not a prion.
Did you have another question, Dee, or can I you're done for a minute?
No, I have another question.
Go ahead.
You mentioned there's an increase, the potential of an increase in spontaneous abortions, and I'm curious, Dr. Westra, you mentioned that you said earlier that glyphosate has become the single most impactful tool that our farmers have access to in Colorado, I assume over the last 35 years. Do you know of any increase in abortion rates or decrease in live births in cows or horses or anything here that are eating glyphosate sprayed stuff?
No, but I want to clarify for the record, it's been highly impactful in terms of promoting minimum reduced conservation tillage and preserving our soil and our natural resource base.
Okay, sorry, I took that to mean that we were using it more here, or using it a lot, that we use it here, and I'm just curious if there's a linear correlation between the amount that we've used it the last 35 years and an increase in the rates in spontaneous abortions, because we've got a lot of animals here.
Not that I'm aware of, but again, I'm not in that animal science area.
Okay.
And then one last question. How much does Goss's wilt affect yield?
How much does what?
Goss's wilt affect yield? Is it a yield limiting disease?
Depends on how soon or how early in the season it infects the plants. It can completely kill the plant to, I've seen it reduce the yield by maybe a minimum of 20–30%. So it's quite a range, but it will kill the plant completely.
Okay.
And how significant have those problems been in Colorado of yield limiting Goss's wilt?
I'm sorry, say that again.
How significant have we had Goss's wilt problems in Colorado that have actually limited the yield or killed the plants completely?
Well, again, it kind of goes back into the 1980s in the sandier neighborhoods. We can't plow those fields. They just blow to Kansas. So they were all minimum tilled or no-tilled or strip-tilled or ridge-tilled. So in those sandy areas, it was very impactful in the 80s, and there was as much as 100 or 130 bushel yield difference, bushels per acre yield difference between Goss's wilt tolerant or resistant corn hybrids and ones that weren't. Goss's wilt typically required a place of infection, a hailstorm or insect feeding to become infected.
Was glyphosate used on corn in the 80s?
No.
Dia, you're about out of questions.
That was my last one.
Okay, thank you. Who else on the committee has some questions? Okay, do Dan and then Richard, and then we'll come over here.
Okay.
Yep.
Before I get to a question, I guess I have a small statement, but you know, this is on a small scale, but I think you have to take what we've done here tonight, and you have to realize that every farmer in this room, every agricultural producer, livestock, whatever you do, every one of us are good, or try to be good stewards of the land. And we take exactly what we've done here tonight, and we constantly ask questions if the stuff we are doing, if the procedures we are doing meet standards that are acceptable to everybody. Can we make them better? Is there a product out there that we're using that is not right for the system? And this is exactly how we do it. We have experts here that have, Dr. McNeill, he made the statement that in some of his research, he theorized he had some glyphosate issues. They've built a theory, and I assume that at this point now they're studying their theory to see if the theory they built is right or wrong. And we as producers, this is how we make the United States, you know, we have the most pristine food system in the world, and we have the safest food system in the world. And because we have experts that are willing to do this, I mean, that's why we have this good food system. And I think that, you know, everybody in the audience and everybody at the table should just understand that this goes on every day, and that's why we have such a fine system in our world.
Do you have a question you'd like to
Yes,
ask as well?
I do. I have a question. To each one of you, if you could use a crystal ball, and you understand Colorado's, you understand our system in Boulder County now, all of you have been apprised of it. Do you honestly feel that we could come up with a glyphosate issue or a chemical issue with the rotation systems that we utilize in Boulder County?
Can you clarify that statement in terms, are you asking, do I believe glyphosate-resistant crops be used in Boulder County successfully?
Do you believe that with the rotation systems that we have in place in
Right.
Boulder County that most people use,
Right.
And do you think we would come up with resistant issue weeds, or do you think that we would come up with chemical issues that, you know, are present in Iowa, that are currently present in Iowa? And we have to acknowledge that there are chemically resistant weeds to glyphosate. But in our system, I think we as producers are trying to minimize that risk.
My opinion is the risk would be minimal, but I can't say it would be zero. I think vigilance would be, you know, the order of the day. Rotating herbicides, not using glyphosate every year, not using it excessively, not burdening the ecosystem, as Dr. McNeill is talking about, would be in your favor. And I think I would be in the position of saying every pesticide has its risks and its benefits, and you have to weigh what those are and how do they balance out in the long run.
Okay. Dr. McNeill?
I don't believe that you have as high a risk that we have in Iowa, but I do believe that there is a potential for, because your soil's a little more fragile, but the risk is definitely not as high as it is in Iowa.
Can you clarify how come? Can you clarify how come it's not, the risk is not as high as it is in Iowa?
The reason I would say that is because of your crop rotation. Crop rotation is very, very important. And I am assuming that you're not using glyphosate with each crop. The examples that I saw the last couple of days, you were not. But if you were to use it every year, say as a burn down before you planted a non-GMO crop, for example, then your probability increases dramatically.
Okay. Thank you.
The potential for resistant weeds is always there. But I think in Boulder County and in most of the rest of the Front Range here, we're working hard to make sure that we use the multiple modes of action so that we could minimize that chance for resistance. I wouldn't disagree that not using Roundup or glyphosate, as far as glyphosate resistance would go, would every year would be a good way to do it. It doesn't mean, though, that you should say, well, every other year you can only use glyphosate, because there are certain rotations and certain situations that come on where you say, yeah, I need a burn down this year. Well, do we want to go use paraquat that as a burn down that might go over to the neighbors and cause spot drift or something? You know, when we look at burn down or we look at our choices of herbicides, we do have to choose about safety for the neighborhood. We have to have that good neighbor policy as well as consider what's going on in that field.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Dan? Richard?
Just a quick follow-up on Dan's question. If you go into these rotations and you've used glyphosate, let's say with a sugar beet crop, and then you move to a subsequent crop that isn't Roundup Ready resistant, are you going to see yield drags on those subsequent crops from the carryover effect of the glyphosate residuals or their metabolic byproducts?
My answer would be no. I've actually done that research in the study I was alluding to for 13 years. There was absolutely no observable impact of using glyphosate on the same exact piece of ground 13 years in a row. Every year, that's all it ever saw. You got to understand that glyphosate is tightly adsorbed to organic matter and clay particles in the soil. This is not something that leaches readily and just moves through the soil. It's adsorbed, it's tied up, it's complexed, pretty much stays where it ends up in the soil. And the idea that a plant or subsequent crop is going to suck up all this glyphosate out of the soil doesn't make any sense, because it does not like to partition into what we call the plant available water, the water that the plant needs to survive, when it's adsorbed to the soil and organic matter. It's tied up, it's just sitting there. So it's just a very unusual molecule in the sense that we do not, to my knowledge, anybody with deep knowledge of that product, believe that it is what we call a residual or a soil active herbicide. It is not.
I would disagree. The addition of phosphorus to the soil will cause desorption. I have seen trials with that, and addition of phosphorus in the form of animal manures or commercial fertilizers will release it.
Okay, thank you.
I can't speak to that, but I can say over the years, in 25 or 30 years, we've used Roundup, glyphosate, other forms of glyphosate, hundreds and hundreds of times as a pre-plant or pre-emerge burn down for weeds that are already there. It's one of the standby things that we're using in conventional beets in Boulder County today is a glyphosate application 1 or 2 days ahead of beet emergence. I never see any beet emergent issues at all. I got situations where we use pumpkins, use glyphosate as a weed control in pumpkins before the pumpkins come up. All perfectly labeled and legal things to do. There's hundreds of uses to put glyphosate down ahead of emergence, either as a pre-plant or pre-emerge treatment. Have seen no problems with that at all.
Okay. So, Richard, did you have another question?
Yeah, that was just a follow-up.
Yeah.
One of my, let me make a comment. Some of the questions about regulatory agencies and so forth that have arisen here deal with, well, one mention was made by you, Kent, I believe, and about European agencies. I think you were alluding to, maybe you didn't say that specifically, like the European Union had pretty much declared that some of these health effects, human or animal, were not really well-founded. There's a lot of information about that and the review process, however, that has shown that they have clearly rejected an awful lot of the inputs without full consideration. So I'll just leave it at that. And let me deal with the issue here of where the research is appearing and where it's coming from in the world predominantly on health effects both to humans, livestock, and broader environmental organisms. And it just isn't, over the last 30 plus years that glyphosate's been around, it hasn't been coming out of the US. And only in the last maybe 5 to 10 years are we beginning to see research appearing, but almost entirely from elsewhere. Now, I will ask, why is that happening, and why are the US academic institutions and research facilities not coming up with this? Is it because of the requirements by the manufacturers that will not allow certain types of research to be done without their explicit approval?
Does anybody want to try and answer that one?
Sure.
Okay, thank
I
you,
don't
Dr.
believe that
Winston.
for 1 minute. If you have the money, you can research anything you want in an American university. There is tremendous academic freedom. Now, you could argue, who's going to step up and give you $500,000 or $1 million to research that particular topic? And that's a whole different issue. I think if you really want to be serious about delving into the literature, you really have to evaluate the quality of the journals where it's published. There clearly are big differences in the standards imposed, and I suspect you would agree with me that not all journals are equivalent in terms of their rigor and what they expect in terms of peer-reviewed quality. And I'm not suggesting that all of this has only been published in secondary journals, but I think that's sort of a whole different topic area in terms of that research area, the credibility of the scientists, the credibility of the publications, and you can go on the web and publish anything you want today, but peer-reviewed, serious science, that's a whole different matter.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else?
Could I make a quick comment on that? Just
Can you just let them answer?
Sure.
Let's let them answer first, because we've also got.
yeah, no problem. Okay, go
thank
ahead.
you.
Okay, I was going to say, when I purchase seed as a farmer, I sign an agreement when I purchase that seed that I will not do any research with that. And so that does limit me to some extent. If I want to fall on the sword and do it, I guess I can. But I dare not share it publicly or it will cost me money.
Interesting. Thank you.
This is a little bit on topic and a little bit off topic, because when it comes down to it, you really want to know who thinks GE crops are safe. You know, I have data here that says the Royal Society in the UK, the National Academy of Sciences, the World Health Organization, the World and Agricultural Organizations of the United Nations, the European Commission, the French Academy of Medicine, American Medical Association, 25 Nobel Prize winners, and 3,400 prominent scientists have all expressed their support for the advantages of genetically modified foods and crops as powerful and safe ways to improve agriculture and environmental safety of biotech crops, of the environment. So, you know, when I see, I'm nobody, but when I look at and say that those prominent organizations are looking at this and say it's okay, I don't feel too bad about that.
Kent, I have a request from the committee. Can we get a copy of that list that you just read? If you could make sure it gets to David and then it'll be distributed. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Richard, did you have one more question?
One more.
Okay, one more.
It's an entirely different subject here that
Okay.
I would like to raise, and that is the concern about our pollinators and some of the, this is not necessarily a GMO question, although it may be. I don't think we have the research to know for sure on that, but there is a definite concern with some of the insecticides that are used, and in particular a class of insecticides called neonicotinoids that have been definitely implemented by our own EPA, but ignored by the time it got to the management rulemaking process. And I would like some comment of the panelists here on that subject as to whether or not those neonicotinoids should in fact not be allowed because of the concerns with our pollinator health.
I guess I can't speak to that class of chemistry specifically, but in our research program in the weed lab at CSU several years ago, we had a very, very large research project in which pollen was being collected from hives and submitted for analysis with a GC mass spec or HPLC as was appropriate. And the allegation was that these pollinators were picking up all these pesticides out in the field, dragging them into the hive, killing the bees. And lo and behold, after about 2 years of research, there essentially was nothing there that we could detect in terms of a pesticide. And I think this was prior to the documentation of the varroa mite as a serious hive problem. And our data showed that they were not dragging pesticides from the field into the hive and causing the demise of the bee colonies. Now, whether the neonicotinoids are doing some of that, I couldn't say. I don't recall this is probably about 10 years ago. So I couldn't address your class of chemistry specifically.
Okay, anybody else in relation to Richard's question before we move on?
I'm not sure I've done a thorough enough job to be able to answer that fully, but I did check out whether or not there was going to be BT exhibited if we were growing triple stack corn, for example, and we had BT corn borer and protein exhibited in that plant. Would I have BT corn borer protein exhibited in the pollen, and was assured by that's not the case, that those proteins are not exhibited in the pollen? I thought that might be one of your questions about bees. When it comes to the neonicotinoids, we're getting kind of short on what we can use for insecticides. So if we don't use a neonic, then we're going to end up using an organophosphate to do the same kind of job, which is an older class of chemistry and probably a whole lot more toxic. Whether or not it's more toxic for bees, I guess we used it for 40 years or so and didn't seem to have bee problems then. But, you know, we really are very careful about bees in this county.
Okay. Thank you.
We really are.
Dr. McNeill, did you have anything you wanted to add? No. Okay. Jules, you had a question?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. First, back to our conversation yesterday, Dr. McNeill. I've never been to Iowa, and I was very intrigued by our conversation, and I was probably under the understanding that probably since you got most of your irrigation from the sky, that our weed pressures or weed problems would be somewhat different, but you told me that you had an extreme amount of weed pressure there too. But you told me that one of the things you have done or is told your producers that you would replace the Roundup or a trip of Roundup with a product called Corvus. Is that correct?
Yes.
And is that something that you would put down and then you would follow up with a Roundup treatment later, so you would eliminate a Roundup application?
We've been using that last 2-3 years and have not had to follow it up with anything. Generally, it works quite well. It is a product similar to Balance. They have added a new safener and a new grass killer in combination with that, and it appears to work very effectively in the corn. Some people have had issues with Balance and switched to Corvus and had no problems.
Did you have a second question?
Well, I'm still following up on the first. Do you have any concerns about the safety issue or the residue that this product would leave in the soil?
I have some, yes, and I've been watching it carefully. I think it could potentially carry over, particularly could be a problem with sugar beets.
Okay. And then also you said that some farmers are buying corn seed that wouldn't have a Roundup Ready trait, but would have maybe a BT trait or a rootworm trait. Is that true?
Yes.
Now, if they have that trait, would they still not be a GMO crop?
No, it would be a GMO crop.
Okay, all right, I wanted to clarify that. And then Kent, I know you've been in this area for a long time, but you know, we've had protocols in place for Roundup Ready and BT corn in Boulder County, I think since '03, and so in your experience in that time frame, have you experienced any problems with the protocols or what we've had in place as far as any issues or any contamination or any problems with buffers or anything like that?
I'm not aware that we've had any problems at all with what we've done. There are issues with the things that we couldn't do, the things that we still need that we haven't been using. It's just like we don't have BT rootworm, so we're forced to use other methods to control rootworms in those corn-on-corn fields, neonics for one. So, you know, from a standpoint of the success we've had in the county with the GMOs that we've already been using, following the labels and following the guidelines, we haven't had any problems at all that I'm aware of, and even within the state.
Okay.
I'm good.
You're done. Okay. Yul, you have a question?
Yeah, Dr. McNeill, I imagine that after spending a few days here, you realize that Boulder County is a very unique area with unique people, very highly educated, and there's quite a few people in this community, I think you've figured out, that have done a lot of research on their own, and they've just decided that they just don't want GMOs here, even if everybody in the world says that they're great. And so my question to you would be that if the county commissioners did decide that they were going to make that policy, And they wanted to bring you in to assist the growers, to assist the county in implementing a non-GMO policy over a number of years or what have you. What would be, paint us a picture as to how you would work with these growers and with the county, and whether you think this would be feasible, and how you think it would affect the growers in particular.
I can relate that probably to how I work with my own growers. We are seeing a need to shift away from the GMOs because we can make more profit. We feel that we're correcting some issues that didn't work properly for us. I have studied hard ways to combat some of the negative aspects of what glyphosate and some of the GMOs are doing to our crops and our livestock by changing nutrition. And I think I can do some things that would be helpful based on successes that I've had in Iowa. I realize that you're working with quite a different climate. You have weed issues that are different because they're introduced by some of your irrigation water. I see the rotation of different crops being nice to work with. That would make the job a little easier. But I would use similar technologies that I've used there and would expect probably similar successes.
Thank you.
Dr. McNeill, are you anti-GMO?
No, I think that GMO may have its place, but in a lot of ways that we are currently using it, it certainly has a lot of negatives, and I'm concerned with those negatives.
The rates on glyphosate that they were putting on in corn, soybeans, year after year, I imagine that they raised the rates on glyphosate while they were spraying. Could this be part of the problem? And did they ever raise them high enough to go off label?
The answer to that's yes. I have seen growers go off label, and when they do, the problem increases rapidly. I think that they go off label thinking that it is a cheap way to kill the weeds that are in their fields, not really necessarily realizing that they are resistant, and no matter how much they put on, they may not die. And you explained some of the work that you've been doing in looking at giant ragweed. And you spray a giant ragweed, the leaf burns off, you think you've killed the plant. And then new leaves pop out and new stems, and now instead of one stem, you have 3 or 4. And so the growers, well, if I put more on, that'll certainly fix the problem. And I think that has exacerbated the problem, and we're seeing more issues because of that increased usage.
And I had a question for Kent and Phil. If Mr. McNeill wants to comment on, that's fine. Another question is, how is our soil health since we've been using biotechnology in this area?
How's the soil health since we've been using biotech?
I've been pulling soil samples for 30 years, and from a soil sampling standpoint, soil testing standpoint, nutritional value, recommendations of what I've made for fertilizers, I'm not seeing any negative effects at all along that line. I will say that what I've started doing in the last couple of years is that I've had to adjust my yield goals up because I'm yielding, the crops are yielding higher. And I'm finding that I have nitrogen deficiencies when I would use the old yield goals. And the carryover nitrogen levels are lower. One of the things that we're trying to do with beets, the quality fraction of beets is that you need to have a nitrogen deficient period late in the fall for them to really concentrate sugar well, or a very cold period. So when we come out of beet fields, we usually don't have a whole lot of nitrogen left. And since the places that we've grown Roundup Ready beets, the yields have been 5 to 8 ton higher than anything that I had seen before.
Yeah. We'll take a question from Dan and from Dean, then I'm going to wrap this up.
It kind of relates to everything they've been talking to. But we've talked about the conventional and going GMO, and we've addressed a lot of the herbicide issues, but I'd like each of you to address, if we go to conventional, non-stacked, non-traded corn, soybeans, whatever we're doing, let's discuss the insecticide issue. We're going to start seeing a greater increase in the use of insecticides to cover some of the traits that the GMOs have allowed us to reduce insecticides on, aren't we?
If you do nothing but switch, yes. But I have found that by improving plant nutrition, by adding more micronutrients where needed, I get a healthier plant, and with a healthier plant, I have much less insect infestation, much less.
Well, I totally agree that, a healthier plant is going to be able to fight off an insect problem much easier. And you don't always have the option to say, all right, now I got to make sure that I grow oats this next year because of whatever, or that I have to grow the crop that I'm growing, or maybe there's something else that happens. And as soon as you're in that position, we've had the advent, we're going down this trail where little by little we're losing valuable tools in the toolbox to allow us to use this for this organism or this for this organism. Whole classes of things that we say that 20 years ago we said we felt like these were safe. And now we say, maybe we're not so sure, whether it's because the guy doesn't want to put the stuff in the planter box, or whether it's because there's a problem with water, erosion into the watershed or whatever. Little by little, we don't have the research going on in chemistry today to come up with new classes of pesticides. We have to have every tool possible. In Boulder County, it seems like it would make the most sense to want to embrace GMOs because of the safety issues. When we think about the idea that if we don't use this, then we might have to go run another airplane trip across that field, or we'll have to figure out another way to go ground rig something. Along the way, it's sometimes about what's the lesser of two evils.
I do have a final question. First, I want to comment on Yule's question to Dr. McNeill about our tenants going back to non-GMO crops and the suggestion that perhaps they don't know how to grow non-GMO crops. Our tenants are currently growing non-GMO sugar beets, and if they have crop consultants, they have crop consultants locally that can help them do that. I think every farmer in the county probably knows how to grow non-GMO alfalfa because that's what they've been growing their entire career. And there's very few, I think, non-GMO or GMO corn has been around for maybe 10 years, and most of our farmers have more than 10 years experience and probably remember how to grow non-GMO corn. So that is experience that they all have under their belts. You kind of answered my question a little bit, Ken, so I'm going to ask this different. Do you think, in general, not speaking just about glyphosate, but a bigger picture, and speaking about agriculture, not food safety, because we're not going to address food safety by what we're growing, food safety on a large scale by what we're growing on 20,000 acres. In terms of this 20,000 acres, is a ban on GE crops consistent with the goal of reducing the toxicity and persistence of the pesticides on the acres that we're talking about? Sorry.
Say your last sentence one more time, please.
Is the ban on GE crops consistent with the goal of reducing the toxicity and persistence of pesticides on bees, or on our, is it consistent with reducing the impact on the environment of our lands?
No, not at all. I think it's totally just the opposite. I think by putting these farmers in a position where they can't have the same rights to grow stuff that they do in the rest of the country, it forces us into situations where we have to make preventative measures. We know that we can't do this, and we know that we won't be able to do this, so we better do this right now. We're already in that boat. You know, we have situations where we put a ground rig application on a field because there's too many houses next door to it, and we don't want to cause a problem with the neighborhood. So we'll use a preventative miticide. For example, a miticide that doesn't even have a bee warning on it. So it's very safe, but it's expensive. Now, a farmer would just as soon have me do my job from an integrated pest management standpoint and say, tell me when I've reached the threshold to spray for this. So, well, we can't use that threshold now because if we did, then we have to use an aerial insecticide that potentially is going to kill more bees. And, you know, it isn't going to take it back to the hive, but, you know, or we have to take a yield loss because we can't do it. So there's all kinds of trade-offs we're making already. Are we going to reduce the environmental load? I think there's a lot of data worldwide that says that GE crops are improving the environmental quality in the world.
Okay. Dr. Westra or Dr. McNeill, any final comments?
Well, I guess I would like to thank you all for inviting me here. It's been very enlightening. It's been a very interesting discussion. I've appreciated the opportunity to share with you some of my concerns and some of the things that I'm seeing happen, and I fully realize that they don't all relate exactly to you, but I think that some of them could, and my concern for that, I think, has been expressed. So again, thank you very much for allowing me to share some of my experiences with you.
Now let's thank the panel for being here, please. And you were going to say something too.
I would like to thank you for coming tonight, your attentiveness. It truly is an honor to have been up the road about 50 miles at the land-grant university, Colorado State University, with 35 absolutely outstanding graduate students working in agriculture. Many of the topics we covered tonight, we've done research on. I truly appreciate the opportunity to come and share some of those results and those feelings and opinions with this group. Thank you.
Thank you guys very much for being here. And thank you for being so respectful this evening. And committee, thank you for your work. I have a request. Our next meeting's a week from today. That is quick, I know that. I also know that you're muddling around in your brains policy ideas around GMOs, practices. So anything that you would like us to then have for our draft for a draft that we can work from for next time, please be sure and get that to David. Yes.
It's an opportunity for final comments.
I did, and they turned.
I didn't see that.
Yes, I
okay,
did.
sorry.
That's okay, Richard. And so thank you very much. Our meeting next week is at 5:30, and it is back at Parks and Open Space. We'll see you then.